So again, many thanks for the cooperation, and to Dubai Cares for making this work possible. We'll also have a chance to hear from our fellow panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves in more depth. But we have Jackie with us here from UNHCR, and Leila also here from NetHope, and both are members of the 22-person advisory board that has really steered the substance of this declaration and has given it shape. I want to just talk a little bit about why a declaration. We know we see a lot of these types of instruments in the education space. We've seen a lot of different declarations around connectivity, but I wanted to talk about the rationale why we think this is so important. One is the context of COVID. We know that the idea of sort of connected education had been important before the pandemic, but now this is suddenly very much in the spotlight, yet there's not a lot of kind of normative understandings to guide this work to ensure connectivity for education. And we hope that the declaration will fill this void. Also, in our search of the literature and looking at other declarations, we saw a lot of declarations that were very much focused on connectivity for people in general. Connectivity for reasons of health and reasons of social inclusion, reasons of political participation, other things. But we saw very few that were focused on the specific needs around education. And we think that the declaration really fills this gap and does provide a lot of guidance, speaking specifically to how connectivity and education are interrelated. So I think that's one of the really important things that the declaration does. As our advisory board can testify, this declaration has been through many, many iterations. So the text that we have prepared and we will be overviewing, it puts forward 3 principles and then commitments under each of those principles. And we wanted to keep the declaration as something that is manageable and memorable. So we didn't sort of try to do absolutely everything, but we wanted to include what we felt were the most important kind of guiding principles and norms for connectivity moving ahead. During this session, we will introduce each of these 3 principles and talk about some of the commitments underneath each of those principles. I wanted to now give a chance to Saeed to talk a little bit more about some of the rationale behind the declaration and also its launch and endorsement at the RewirEd Summit later this year. So Saeed, over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mark, and really a pleasure to be a part of this panel. So my name is Saeed Ismaili, and I am a programs manager at Dubai Cares. Perhaps it might be useful to give a bit of a background of the history of how this declaration came into existence and the thinking behind it before I move over to the roadmap and also what we envisage that would happen post the launch of the declaration in December. So for Dubai Cares, the idea behind the declaration goes all the way back in 2018, since we actually have been starting our work in the education on emergency space, where it became very apparent to us how detrimental the lack of connectivity and access to appropriate portable learning material can be for a learner that is on the move. So we started discussions with some of our partners on the idea of having a unified framework for connectivity and digital learning for the refugee community. Now, fast forward 2 years later, the entire world has witnessed the biggest learning disruption in history. And as our CEO would put it, we suddenly all became refugees as the learning losses and disruptions hit almost every household. we immediately knew that this would be the right moment to galvanize effort and mobilize international collaboration towards leveraging meaningful connectivity, and really having an honest discussion about the challenges and opportunities. So we quickly turned around to our friends in UNESCO to kind of like start thinking and cooking this idea about a declaration on connectivity for education that would be unveiled during the RewirEd Summit, which takes place in December 2021. So the process of building this declaration and its three main principles, as Mark has mentioned, is a solid example of what a multi-stakeholder partnership and collaboration should be, where the essence of the priorities and the asks were heavily informed and influenced by a group of technical advisors representing the private sector, the NGO sector, and civil society. And there was, I mean, as Mark said, there has been, several versions of reiterations as we developed the zero draft of the declaration, but there was a unanimous consensus on the importance of more collaboration and better coordination, and not starting from scratch, but rather building on previous body of work and existing initiatives. The declaration will be launched and celebrated at the RewirEd Summit, which, as I said, would take place between the 12th to the 14th of December, where we will welcome endorsement, support, and championing of the declaration, and committing to working together on implementing and operationalizing the declaration on the ground. Of course, we at Dubai Cares, we are fully committed to operationalizing the declaration. We are working closely with our partners to determine what that would entail and how would a phase 2 post-launch would look like. There is a number of initiatives that we're already working on, such as an investor roundtable on financing connectivity that would also take place in December, recognizing that the financing aspect is a key factor in achieving universal connectivity and better learning outcomes. And finally, as I mentioned, we also envisage that declaration would provide a framework for alignment between different global initiatives, such as the UN Secretary General Roadmap for Digital Cooperation and the recently announced Common Agenda, and also GIGA, among many other initiatives. So yeah, thank you very much. And over to you, Mark.
Thanks so much, Saeed. Again, all very clear, and the result of this this really excellent and ongoing cooperation. And as Saeed mentioned, we're also very excited about the phase 2 and looking forward to operationalizing this important declaration. I mean, it doesn't stop with the text. This text is valuable insofar as it is noticed, and it does establish norms for connectivity efforts with regards to education. Just a bit more framing information about the text. I put a link to the text, so for those of you who would like to see it for yourselves, it's there. It's now open for public input, and there's an option on that link that I provided to give public input. The declaration is still taking final shape, so this is a true consultation. We make good note of all the input we receive about the declaration and work to polish and refine it. So we look forward to getting your feedback on these different principles, and then maybe on the declaration as a whole towards the end of this session. In the framing for the declaration, we really put forward that there are two interrelated challenges for connectivity in education. I think the first one is very well known. The second one, less well known. The first one is simply this problem of access. we just have far few many people that are not connected technically. They lack devices, they lack the networks that reach those devices. It's simply a technical challenge. But the second challenge, and we at UNESCO have really been trying to emphasize that this challenge is quickly eclipsing the technical challenge as the price of connectivity goes down, as networks sort of expand, more and more rural regions are connected. This second challenge is it's an educational challenge. It's about capacity and skills to make meaningful use of connectivity for education. And we see again and again that this is the primary challenge facing a lot of teachers and learners. Of course, the technical challenge is still there and very pronounced in some contexts, but in many parts of the world, the challenge is one of capacity. And that means having teachers who are knowledgeable to leverage connectivity for education. Of course, students in the context of the pandemic, that meant families as well. And so our declaration pays a lot of attention to both of those challenges, not merely the technical and access challenge, but also the challenges around the pedagogy and other things. So we'll have a chance to dive into those different aspects. So again, the text is there for you. We have some slides to kind of complement this, but we'd now like to transition into principle number 1, which Jackie will be presenting. So Jackie, over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And I think both the intros provided a really nice picture of why this declaration is so important. I'm Jackie Strecker. I am the lead of UNHCR's Connected Education efforts, and we've been working in this space for decades now, trying to really ensure that refugees and forcibly displaced learners are able to benefit from the technological advances that so many educators and learners around the world are able to leverage. And just to echo the remarks that were made, we particularly saw the struggle during COVID, especially as governments started to move towards multimedia forms of learning, just how disadvantaged forcibly displaced learners who were in low resource contexts were from being able to access, because the infrastructure investments weren't there, the capacity investments that Mark, you touched on, weren't there. And this is why this first principle is so central and so important. And I think what really helps to make the difference in this declaration, because it's looking at centering the most marginalized of the learners and of the educators. What we've seen in the past is that often investments go in a pilot phase to target high resource environments to already privileged learners and educators. And it's often thought of that later, as these efforts will scale out, that they will then go to reach those at the margins. But what we find is if we're not designing for inclusion from the start, these programs just really aren't able to meet the needs of low resource learners, whether they be refugees, learners with disabilities, women and girls. And so by really centering the most marginalized, it's principle to really look at recalibrating our policies and approaches and really trying to find ways that we can design from the start with an inclusive approach. Now, this doesn't mean designing initiatives that are parallel to what's being done at the national level, but rather ensuring that initial designs really can accommodate the widest reach possible, and thus meaning we've got more inclusive, but also more sustainable approaches in the end. So this does have 4 elements, and I'll go through them briefly. But the first one is committing to ensuring connectivity reaches all individual learners. So we need to ensure that internet is always available, that it's accessible anytime, anywhere for both teachers and students. And so guided by an ethic of inclusion, it's really looking at reaching those disadvantaged in a way where they can not only have marginal access, but be meaningfully connected to today's world and to today's digital infrastructures. So this means supporting learners, for example, who are out of school, for them to find pathways back into formal education. This is also just fully grounded in this notion of educational equality and really making sure that we are targeting individual learners wherever they may be. And part of this, as Mark had talked about, really focuses on capacity. So looking at improving digital skills and training to make sure people can benefit from being able to access these further investments. The next piece is on sustainable financing for universal connectivity for education. And here we note that connectivity is no longer a luxury, but is an essential form of infrastructure, and that we see a lot of limited public financing around universal connectivity. We've all seen, I think, at one point in time, investments made in a school, and you return 2-3 years later, and that school is suddenly disconnected. And so we need to transition away from thinking of one-time expenditures to really looking at robust, predictable, sustainable investments that are being made. So we need to ensure that connectivity is not only established, but it's sustained, and that those that learn to use it and build up their capacities have that understanding that this will be a resource that's going to be invested in and that they'll have access to for the duration of their education and their teaching. The next piece is really looking at helping to assure clear and affordable connectivity for different education options. So many of you might have found, if you ever travel to a different country and you're trying to make your way through all of the different options that mobile providers find, it can be very, very confusing to understand the current options. And just imagine if you had low literacy skills, that if you didn't have a degree of broader digital competencies, it can be entirely confusing. And so we need to look at ways of creating clear and quick and distinguishable connectivity plans that really are clear in terms of which ones aid learning the best. We also need MNOs, so mobile operators, to take on responsibility and offer basic and easy to understand connectivity for education plans. So this is really important for making sure that people who want to individually, parents, for example, access these resources, teachers, ministers, that they can understand what options are available to them and make the right choices. We also need to ensure that connectivity is viewed as part of the state's commitments to providing free and inclusive quality public education. And when we think about the most marginalized, this is very important. We can't look at the cost of education being put on towards the community. We always know that it's really expensive sometimes for parents to even pay for their children to go to secondary school because of the additional costs, be it textbooks, be it uniforms. And so really looking at how connectivity can be invested in as a public good, which doesn't relay the cost to individual students or parents, but is part of that commitment for free and inclusive quality learning. The last piece is around a commitment to ensure connected technology supplements, expands, and enriches formal and impersonal education, not replacing it. So I think everyone on this call probably agrees that education is a social activity, that schools, education institutions, and educators should remain the primary interface for education. And this is really important for disadvantaged students who often rely on schools not only for academic development, but also as a form of nutrition, protection, and socialization. And so we really need to ensure that technology is used to supplement and support schools and allow them to continue to be a central place within communities for learning. So this just focuses on some of the key elements within the report, but now I'd like to pause for a moment and open it up to those on the call to hear from you if you agree with the tenets of this principle, if you think there's important elements that we need to add, or why you might agree with me that this is one of the most important elements of this principle that's unique within the context of this work. So please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, come on in.
And you can also use the chat function.
Yeah, I know it's always hard when you get kick-started with opening things up, who's going to be the first to break the ice. But we really do, as Mark had noted, this has been a really consultative process. And we applaud the efforts of both UNESCO and Dubai Cares for approaching the declaration in this matter. And I think this is what has been sort of vital to having this work really land with sort of all of the actors that stand behind it, but also governments who are helping to endorse the declaration. All right, well, maybe I was so clear and distinct, so we can move on to the other principles, and I'll take the questions later. But just to note, if this is an area as well that you'd like to learn more information on, I'll just do a little bit of a plug that coming up next in the mEducation Alliance session, we do have a session that's going to look at designing EdTech with the inclusion of refugees, and walk through some practical examples of how partners have done this in the past. So I'll include the link. That's going to start at 10:30. But if you'd like to know a little bit more, that's a session that we can dive into. But maybe Mark, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Jackie. And again, we will also take questions again at the end for principle number 1, if others have further comments. And the declaration itself is there for public comment for people if they want to engage it at a different time or want time to sort of think through their reactions to it. But thank you, Jackie, for that crystal clear explanation of principle 1. We're now moving into principle number 2. And this really speaks to issues of content, which we thought were overlooked in a lot of other declarations. A lot of things talk to the importance of, access and other things that Jackie went over. This principle really speaks to the importance of having excellent and meaningful and relevant educational content in digital spaces. And this principle is really steered by this understanding that there should be public and freely accessible places for public and free education in online spaces. And by our analysis, this is missing in so many countries, that there are good options for public education in schools and in physical places. But when it moves into virtual and online spaces, there are very few public options, or what public options may exist are very scattered or very centered on simply one discipline, but not particularly useful for students to sort of think through their level of education, whether that be their grade level, the school that they're attending, or other things. So this principle is at core a call for governments, other stakeholders to really increase investments for public education in online spaces. I think COVID has helped to sort of turbocharge this. We saw a lot of governments who didn't have any sort of digital space for education, build them in a hurry. But again, some of these were sort of scattered and all over the place. And in our analysis, we're saying that there should be sort of very clear entry points for public education in an online space, just as there is for in-person schooling. I mean, it's very clear where people go to access face-to-face education. It should also be equally clear where people go to get clear and validated educational content. We see that many private sector providers have moved into this space, and they're offering often excellent options, but feel that those, again, there's a place for those, but there should also be places where people can access educational content for free. We also make a case that while we often talk about the supply side of connectivity and devices, people need devices, they need connectivity. There's also an aspect of demand. And we think that by building great educational content that is freely accessible, that will create a demand for connectivity when people feel that and they will make a case to provision the devices and connectivity plans that are needed to access that device. So we think there's a sort of virtuous case that if you build great content, people will come online. And indeed, if you ask people why they pay for devices and connectivity, they all talk about content. A lot of that content right now is entertainment based and other things, but we feel there's a strong case to be made that if there's great learning content, that will increase demand for connectivity and for devices. So as Jackie did, I'm just going to take a minute to go through our sort of 3 underlying principles under this principle number 2. So this is a commitment to develop and maintain public options for public education on the internet. And I wanted to also sort of remind, my own field was history, but throughout history with new technologies, there have been serious investments to build public spaces for that. One great example is the radio. When the radio first came out, it was being used for all sorts of, all sorts of various purposes and other things. A lot of that was creating political polarization, a lot of that sort of unsavory content that was moving around on the radio. And governments realized that they should publicly finance public radio. The first country to really make major investments, the UK, built the BBC, and that became a sort of a public space for public radio that exists to this day, providing a public service. We're hopeful that there can be something similar with regards to education and the internet. Why is it that somebody who's in secondary education cannot have a clear space where they can access learning, high quality learning content online? Principle, the second point under this, B, about providing differentiated educational resources for diverse audiences. This is just to say that there should be entry points for the many people involved in education. There should be clear entry points for teachers. There should be clear entry points for families and parents, and of course, clear entry points for students. That's a sort of minimum, but we can also see, of course, there are also entry points for policymakers, entry points for just, concerned, involved citizens, but to build resources that are meaningful for those different people, and again, that are easy to find, and people have trust in them. A final point number C here is to monitor the adaptation and application of these digital utilities. And this is where we see that people are not really paying attention. They put some content, sort of put it online and then forget about it. There should be efforts to hit various numerical targets. I mean, how many students and families are accessing these resources? And if you're not meeting the targets, how can you improve that? Is that a matter of outreach? Is it because the content is not engaging? But the digital space is amazing because it gives you a lot of data about who's accessing it, for how long, how people are using it. Things that we had trouble seeing with paper resources and other things. But this allows governments and other stakeholders to sort of have honesty about it. And this is where we see private sector partners really at the cutting edge. I mean, they're looking all the time at the back end and seeing who's accessing this, when, how are they moving through learning content. And we think for some of these public options, there's a lot to learn there and to replicate. So that's principle number 2 in a nutshell. Wanted to open it up again if there are any comments, reactions, something you agree or disagree with. But again, this is a genuine consultation. The text of this is still continuing to take shape, but would welcome any feedback that people might have. And as Jackie said, please feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Victoria, thanks for your comment earlier. But please, if there's comments on this principle, the floor is open.
We do have in the chat a comment about Principle 1B as well. I can read it out for everyone. Barbie said, I appreciate Principle 1B can't be achieved without forging partnerships at a systems level, as the traditional donor NGO dynamic is typically tied to project cycles. As mentioned, a one and done financing approach is not compatible to the sustainable funding required to ensure an EdTech project remains sustainably connected.
Thanks very much for bringing that into the conversation. Maybe Jackie, because you covered principle number 1, a quick reaction to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely do agree. And I think this is where, as you said, looking at a systems approach and the different actors who are engaged, I think is vital. I think it's really important to look at all of the different actors supporting education and where different comparative advantages lie. So if we know we could have sort of sustained and predictable financing that's coming in to cover the recurrent costs, maybe through public financing, and I don't mean here education financing plans necessarily, because we know education budgets are often stretched, but maybe other resources through national development budgets that could be leveraged, then you could have the roles of other donors and NGOs who come in different capacities. Catalytic funding at the beginning to help set up the initial installation costs, which often we know are quite high at the beginning, could be a good role for a donor. You could also have NGOs helping to support that capacity building, as Mark talked about. So working with ministries of education, building really strong teacher and learner capacity, looking at, what we have here around high quality digital education content, partnerships that could be forged in and around Principle 2 as well. So I think it's really looking at how we can really try to look at the comparative advantages. It would be great to reinvent, I think, our typical project cycles, but that might not be realistic in the short term. But how can we leverage other funding that's coming in, other streams from a systems approach, to really ensure that we can have that type of predictable support coming into schools? So that's just my initial reaction. And it'd be great to pick this up in the conversation that we're going to have towards the end, and hear, Barbie, if you've got further thoughts on that side, if you agree with that approach, if you've got other ideas, and also from the other panelists and presenters and participants joining.
Thanks very much, Jackie. And yeah, I've already hoped that you might be able to elaborate some of that point. At UNESCO, we've also been very clear about this case about sustainable financing. I know that for those of us who are, go on missions to different countries, I mean, you see the sort of detritus of EdTech projects of the past. I've been to, you walk in and there are these, Apple laptops from the late 90s, and they're all sitting in a shed. And, again, there was a project donor, there was money that was spent, and none of those computers have been turned on in 10 years. It's questionable whether they even work. I mean, we see these problems, but encouraged that obviously education systems have managed a way sustainably with schools, with physical schools in many instances. I mean, those are sustained and continue. But again, as Jackie, I think, was alluding to, we want to be careful that this does not become investments in digital spaces do not lead to divestment in the physical spaces of education. It really will require maintenance of both. And I think that many governments are shifting investments to providing services on online spaces and moving investments away from the support that had been provided at a physical, center or office or something else. But education, we're making the case is special, where you need the sustained investments in the physical spaces of school, but you need increased investments to ensure that there are great educational options in online spaces as well. So this is really a sort of both and proposition, rather than sort of shifting investment from one area to the other. And we have seen some evidence of that happening in the wake of COVID. I want to move on to principle number 3 now. We have Leila here with us from NetHope. Leila, thank you again for being with us. If you could please take us through principle number 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jackie. And great to see some of the questions in the chat window. So as noted, we'll go through principle number 3 and then open it up for discussion. So just as a brief introduction, I'm with NetHope, and that is a nonprofit technology consortium of leading global NGOs. I see some might be in this discussion. So organizations like Save the Children, World Vision, also IRC, Mercy Corps, and many others. And NetHope has been working on bringing connectivity to individuals and communities in emergency and low resource settings for nearly 20 years. At NetHope, I lead the Emerging Technologies Initiative that operates at the intersection of technology, ethics and the future of education and work for both nonprofits and the marginalized communities around the world, including in many instances, conflict-affected youth. So I'll take you through the principle 3 and share with you the 4 commitments that the advisory board under the leadership of UNESCO and Dubai Cares has put forward, and invite you to share with us your observations and your feedback. So the principle number 3 is grounded really in the belief that digital spaces can open up learning possibilities. But to do this in an impactful, in a sustainable, in a responsible way, we need new and effective pedagogies that expand student knowledge, that nurture creativity, and also foster responsible digital citizenship. So in the context of pedagogical transformation, the advisory board has focused on 4 key areas. First, using digital spaces to advance new paradigms and possibilities for learning. So what that means that instead of trying to replicate the models of in-person schooling in digital spaces, we need to develop new types of learning content, new pedagogies that take full advantage of the interactive and multimedia capabilities of online and virtual mediums. And it's important to do this in a human-centered way, where teachers and families are involved in the development of digitally supported education. And they're also prepared through training to maximize the educational benefits of connected technologies while being aware of both limitations and risks. So that's the commitment number 1. Second, the responsible and productive use of connected technologies needs to prioritize using technology to strengthen social and civic dimension of learning. What this means is really being deliberate in ensuring that connectivity facilitates connection to a thriving community of peers and teachers and others, not just machine-mediated interaction with learning content. Third, we need to be intentional about protecting student and educator data. So on one hand, we need data to improve teaching and learning. Data can clarify what interventions are more or less effective and help us guide further and future development. It can also help teachers know where students are struggling or thriving in their programs and adjust their interventions. But also data can be misused and abused. So we propose that we have an ethic of transparency and do no harm to guide data policies. And in practice, that might mean a couple of things: that all stakeholders are aware of what data is being collected and for what purposes, that most data is anonymized by default, so it cannot be traced back to individuals. Some of the additional thoughts that we included in the declaration focused on educational institutions working to pass ownership and control of personal data to the people this data concerns. In the cases, obviously, of children, families should be involved in decision-making. And then whenever possible, learners should be able to opt out of the data collection and still retain full access to all of the educational opportunities. And then finally, we need to promote safe and productive use of the internet through education. Connecting learners is just the first step. We also need to help them learn how to navigate the internet responsibly, and that requires preparing them to use connected technology in a healthy, in a safe, in a productive way. So they know how to be vigilant about their digital footprints and reputations online, while engaging in digital ecosystems to learn, to collaborate, and to create. So if there's one thing you take away from this principle, and I'm distilling in just a few words, is that digital transformation of education is going to be as beneficial and sustainable as our collective ability to both model and teach responsible and productive use of connected technologies. So with that, I'm really looking forward to your questions and any feedback and additions you might have to what we've put forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Leila. Very comprehensive view of principle number 3. and some of these pedagogical transformations that are required to make connectivity meaningful for education. So thank you all for taking time to, for our panelists overviewing the declaration. Jackie, principle number 1, I overviewed some of principle number 3, Leila, principle number 3, and Saeed for providing some of the rationale and some of the longer term vision for this important normative instrument. And wanted to invite your comments now. I see that a couple people have put some comments in the chat, which we appreciate, but Victoria, I don't know if you wanted to maybe to elaborate the point you made about the importance of having multiple mobile operators in a particular context. Agreed that that's extremely important. We've seen examples of that, Myanmar being one that I think was really noticeable, where in the early 2000s, a mobile plan in Myanmar cost hundreds of euros a month, and now is costs just a few euros a month, has become made a lot more affordable since that market has opened up. But Victoria, did you want to come in and maybe drive some of these points home and how they might be meaningful to the declaration?
I think you've driven that one about competition home really clearly, and the graphic that I shared just demonstrates very, very clearly the kind of strong relationship between what is available in the market and what happens to prices. I actually wanted to pick up on something else that Jackie said when she was talking about making access to price plans easier, particularly for people who may perhaps communicate in a different language from the one they're being required to communicate in, who may have limited literacy. I'm old enough to remember what it was like trying to navigate mobile price plans in the UK in the early 90s, and in fact worked in comms for a mobile operator at the time, and it was terrifying, utterly terrifying. So I think that point about clarity and simplicity is also a really, really important one there. And obviously anything that can be done for kind of zero rating access for particular purposes, I think is also important. While I've got the floor, I wanted to say something about principle 3 and the sorry, could you just go back to principle 3 for me? Yeah, about pedagogical transformation. I think all of this is great. I wonder whether you want something in here specifically about both the peril and the promise that presents to teachers, and particularly cadres of teachers who may have been in place for a long time and may be quite worried about working in different ways. And I'll shut up now. And I'm sorry my video's not on, but someone else is chairing a conference in the next room.
No, thank you very much, Victoria. All very, very clear points, very well taken on principle number 1 as well as principle number 3. And something that we will bring back to the advisory board that's continuing to shape and refine this. But thank you very much for the remarks and also the resources. Would anybody else like to take the floor and just reactions, feedback, other points to consider as we continue to shape the declaration for its launch at the RewirEd Summit in December?
Mark, Luke has an interesting comment. And Luke, if you can also expand on your perspective on which paradigms you think should be transformed.
Yeah, please, Luke, take the floor if you'd like. Thank you.
That's a difficult question. I certainly don't have the answer to it. I don't know which paradigms. I mean, we often talk about technology revolutionizing pedagogical practice. We've got new availability of resources, time differentials, all that. It very rarely happens. We often domesticate, this isn't my words, but domesticate existing pedagogical practice into new digital spaces. So when we're talking about digital spaces advancing new approaches to teaching, that's what I assume new paradigms means, I guess. Because we still have very behavioural models adopted across huge parts of the world's education systems, but we still have this illusion that we encourage a sort of constructivist approach perhaps embodied in a lot of digital media and well, let's call it Western discourse for education. So there's some conflict in that. And so how do we ensure that we don't steamroll what is the pedagogical practice of I maybe say, the considerable population of the world's education systems, much in the same way as the sort of, would you say, the one laptop per child had that very narrow paradigm of what education development looks like. So how do we ensure, and I guess this is UNESCO's job really, how do you ensure that you have as broader base for that conversation of what those paradigms are, what change people want to see, and where knowledge sits in those classrooms, and yeah, what type of consultations can be done to stop the capture of the usual suspects. Sorry, that was a bit long.
No, not at all. Thank you, Luke. Really important points. And it's certainly something we're working to think through here at UNESCO. In November, UNESCO will be launching what we're calling our Futures of Education report. So this is a report that's been over 2 years in the making. Every 25 years or so, UNESCO publishes a report that really looks at sort of the purposes of education as well as its organization and kind of taking a distant future view. And we really talk a lot about the importance of maintaining a diversity of pedagogical practices. We talk about some of the risks of this sort of, the way that a technical platform can kind of, a sort of neo-colonialism, if you will, of imposing a certain pedagogy on places where there had been different practices. But although the digital transformation has certainly moved in this sort of direction of bulldozing things and kind of bringing things into a common shape and mold, I think the possibility is still very much there for a diversity of prospects and a diversity of practices and other things, and hope that might be the case. And I'm somewhat encouraged by all of these tech developers you're seeing in hubs like in Nairobi and in Lagos and other places outside of your usual Silicon Valley kind of centers, and building interesting applications and things that involve education as well. And obviously governments are going to have to take the reins on some of this. And a lot of the conversations that we have with governments are, how do we ensure that the solutions that are built for education are built in the country, that we're not just buying something from someplace else. And how do we, use this investment to build the digital capacities in our own country, or help to kind of nurture a nascent tech industry. And I think those are excellent questions that I imagine a lot of people across the UN are getting. And so finding solutions to that. But thanks very much, Luke, for the comments. I don't know, Jackie or Leila, if you wanted to react further. Okay, looks like no. I think Jackie might be frozen. Anybody else would like to take the floor? We just have a few short minutes left, but thanks again for bringing those in. Anybody else? I see Lena is here from NORAD, a couple other people. I know this day is open only to Alliance members, so we're actually quite glad to have a sort of a small group of people who follow this space very closely. I'm sorry we can't be meeting in person in Washington as we usually do, but we're doing the best we can with these digital platforms we've all become familiar with. But I don't know, Lena from NORAD or anybody else have a comment they'd like to bring in. The floor is open.
Hey, Mark, I just wanted to add, I feel the declaration really adds a lot of value to a session that was had by the UN earlier this year around the right to education and how the access to digital was a real barrier to actually realizing that human right. and that because of COVID, it's the first time that we've really seen that being considered. And there obviously wasn't a plan of how do we help achieve this. So I feel that this declaration kind of fills that gap in that place.
Great, thanks a lot for that, and we're glad that's the intent here. And we hope that, you know, to kind of wrap this up, I think it's our hope that this becomes a useful resource for all of you in your respective organizations, that it's something that you can carry forward, use in your own plans for operationalizing various connectivity for education initiatives, can share with your own partners. And again, it's a global document, so it needs to be contextualized to different localities, to different countries, even to different regions. But that's why it's there. So we hope that you will be able to use this to be able to take it forward. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this call, we will be working closely with our advisory group to continue to shape and refine this practice. In late October, we're going to be having consultations with the governments from around the world. We'll be meeting in regional groups. So we will be meeting with each region of the UNESCO representatives and ambassadors to familiarize them with this text, to get their input and feedback on it. We'll also be organizing a consultation with Leila and with NGOs and civil society groups. We'll be organizing a consultation with private sector providers. We'll be organizing consultations with teachers, with researchers, with youth as well. So it's our hope and our expectation by the time that this declaration is finalized, it really reflects a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different perspectives, and is thereby usable and relevant to a lot of different people, and is really establishes some global norms for these efforts that we see ongoing in so many countries and contexts. So with that, I'd like to bring our session to a close. And thanks again to our panelists. I know Jackie had to run off because she's presenting immediately after this, but Leila, many thanks for your time, your expertise, and your support. And Saeed, of course, thank you very much for the ongoing partnership with Dubai Cares, and looking forward to future consultations with you and transitioning to the operational, making this declaration a reality and translating it into action beginning in 2022. And thanks to the audience members for your comments. And again, you have the link for the to the declaration. We're inviting public comments on it, and look forward to hearing any further thoughts you might have on it. So thanks again, and looking forward to the rest of the mEducation Alliance Symposium meetings. Thank you.